Michael, we're back for another riveting episode of Sets and Reps. Are you ready?
That's right. I'm ready for this session of Sets and Reps.
Oh, very good.
I think that might be a better way to call these.
I
was giving that some thought the other
day. A workout session. Right?
Yeah, right?
Yeah, okay,
I just got
that.
done with one, and I thought that would be a little bit smoother transition.
Absolutely. So what we thought we could do today is we capitalize on our immensely popular Demystified series.
Right.
Because we did our demystifying...
Periodization.
Mm-hmm. So we thought we could do maybe a demystifying biomechanics today.
Right.
And kind of look at how some of the concepts within biomechanics can be applied to the area of strength and conditioning. Mm-hmm. Students a lot of times when they take biomechanics classes, they dread it because they've had physics. They don't like physics a lot of times, right? And they come into biomechanics and the first thing that a lot of times professor says is, hey, this is physics applied to the human body, and that word physics just conjures up all these horrible images, right?
Yeah, I think they get really worried, especially depending on how far they go in physics, because you can get into things that don't seem all that relatable, electricity and things of that sort, which actually do have a very large place in biomechanics, especially if we're talking about measurement and evaluation. Right. But they haven't gotten to that point yet where they see those connections. So they're, I think, a little bit overwhelmed and a little bit mystified by all of the things that you could be doing with these biomechanics, because physics, as I'm sure their professors will explain, is kind of the basis for everything.
Right. Well, and to be honest, if you talk to a lot of biomechanists, they'll look at, it's not so much physics as much as engineering that has that's the most direct corollary, if you will, to biomechanics.
And that's kind of how it was explained to me in undergrad, because I kind of had this misconception that it was going to be more like prosthetics or something of that sort, like, the integration of like human engineering or bioengineering with physiology or with whatever movement or action.
Right.
But it was much more basic than that.
Well, in so many of the models in physics are very mechanical in nature, like a pulley system or a lever system or a box on a slope of some sort. And it's very hard to relate to what those things actually pertain to. And so what's neat in a field like biomechanics is you can take those same concepts and apply them to the human body. And so, one of the earliest ones I think that comes on is this distinction between work and power. And we can understand that work is how much force do you create multiplied by what kind of displacement do you create. So for example, if you look at strength training, if I'm doing a squat or a bench press kind of an activity, you can directly measure the amount of work that somebody performs. And when you contrast that to power, it's different in that, by definition, power is going to be the rate at which you perform that work. And so whether it takes me 1 second, 2 seconds, or 3 seconds to lift a given mass, when I'm doing a squat, the work output is the same.
Right.
But the power output then becomes different based on how fast you're actually moving it, right?
Yeah, very true. Now, with that weight train and performing work, since you return it to the starting position, wouldn't that be zero displacement? So you aren't doing anything?
Well, it all depends, because that's kind of that idea of your frame of reference, and it depends upon what is your frequency of measuring, because it kind of plays into this idea that you have vector quantities and scalar quantities within biomechanics, right? And so a scalar quantity does not take into account the direction you're traveling, just the raw value. Yeah. So one of the distinctions you can make, or that's often made in biomechanics, is the difference between distance, for example, and displacement.
Oh, okay.
So displacement is a vector quantity, meaning that it's how far did you travel and what direction did you travel. So, for example, if you have a runner on first base, or in your example, if I'm doing a squat exercise, you have to decide for yourself which direction is going to be a positive direction and which direction is a negative direction. So, for example, typically in strength training exercises, the portion where you're actually lifting the weight, where you're actually fighting against gravity, that's the positive displacement. And then when you're coming downwards or lowering the weight or going in the same direction of gravity, that's the negative displacement.
Okay.
So you're right. So if you look at a full repetition of a squat, the downwards portion is going to be negative because it's a negative displacement. The upwards portion is a positive displacement, and so you're negating one over the other, right? But what an intelligent person would do to mock your little, I did zero work, right? You'd separate the negative portion from the positive portion, or what we call the eccentric portion from the concentric portion. Right.
Yeah, I was going to say, it sounds like you've heard that joke before. You had something prepared for that.
Well, it's the other example would be like if I'm running on a track, for example. It's like, if I run around a 400-meter track, my distance is 400 meters because distance is that scalar quantity, does not take into account direction. But if my displacement were measured, it'd be 0 meters because I ended exactly. But if you break it down even further, what's interesting about that kind of idea is that when I start running that 400-meter race, if I measure my displacement, as I run away from the starting line, I'd have a positive displacement. So basically, about halfway around the track then, I now start to return to my home base or start to return to the finish line. So now I'm negating each of those increments that I have.
see. So you become as far away from the starting position as you can be, and then everywhere after, since a big circle, then you're going to be coming back to it.
So the other idea behind that then is that frequency of measuring. It's not very helpful, for example, if I were running a cross-country race, if I were running a 5K cross-country race, if all I did was take splits if all I had were the final time that you ran, hey, you did that 5K race in 18 minutes, good job. This other person ran it in 19 minutes. But what may be more important to learn is why did that person take a 1 minute longer to run that race? Was there a portion of the race that person struggled with? And so you take that 5K race and you break it down. Well, what is their 1 kilometer time increments? So maybe that person that ran the race a minute slower, maybe they ran the first 4 kilometers faster, but they just didn't have the endurance to run the last kilometer, and so their pace tapered off to the point where now that other runner beat them. And so that frequency of measurement becomes an important attribute. And so the same thing is true in weightlifting, is that if you take an Olympic lift, for example, like a clean or a snatch, if you could break down that movement from the initiation of that first pull to what you might call the scoop and the second pull and the catch position, if you could look at the actual bar velocity, the instantaneous velocity of that bar at each segment of it, you could perhaps notice deficiencies that person might have, right?
Yeah, where the movement's breaking down, where a weak point is, or where you're going to start slowing down. Because that's usually where you miss the lift, is a few inches away from that sticking point, because you start to decelerate that bar, and then it's not that sticking point that's the problem, it's right before that, because when you start to decelerate down to 0.
And you're bringing up another important point, a distinction that oftentimes students have trouble with understanding is this difference between velocity and acceleration. So during an Olympic lift, during the entire clean, from the initiation of that first pull to the split second where you catch it, for the most part that bar has a positive velocity. It's going upwards. Now, during the catch, if you're dropping underneath it, that bar may actually go downwards, in which case you do create a negative velocity at that point. But the idea is that for the most part, as you're lifting upwards, there's a positive velocity. But you're right in the idea that you could have, at some point during that lift, a negative acceleration, meaning that the bar is actually slowing down at certain points of the lift. It doesn't mean that the bar is not still going upwards. It just means it's not going upwards as fast as it was previously.
So that would have a positive velocity still, just a negative acceleration, because it's moving more slowly than it was at a previous segment.
One of the examples I give in my classes is, and I like going to baseball examples because everyone's familiar with kind of how baseball works. But if I'm trying to steal second base, I'm on first base, and if I initially start sprinting towards second base, the entire time I move towards second base, I have a positive velocity because I'm going the direction I'm intending to go. If at some point during my run to second base, I realize that the ball is going to be caught and I need to tag up on first base, then I'm going to stop and I'm going to run back to first base. And so at that point, when I start running or retreating back to first base, I have a negative velocity at that point. But if we were to look at just that raw run to second base, I'm running faster and faster and faster as I accelerate, as I build up speed. But then right before I get to second base, I'm probably going to slide. And so while I'm sliding, I'm slowing down. My velocity is getting smaller, but it's still a positive velocity because I'm still traveling towards second base. And so there's that period of time where I've got a positive acceleration where I'm speeding up, and then at the very end when I'm sliding, I have a negative acceleration, or a deceleration, if you will, when I'm sliding. But it doesn't mean that I'm not still traveling towards second base. And so it's the same kind of concept. With a squat or an Olympic lift of things of that nature. So it kind of leads us to this idea of, when we do traditional strength training exercises, meaning your traditional deadlift or back squat or bench press, one of the problems with those lifts when we try to translate them into sport performance is that all of those movements have a built-in deceleration to them. And so I drop down with my squat and I reach the bottom, and then as I'm going upwards during that concentric portion, no matter how explosive I try to be as I come up out of the hole, at a certain point at the end of the lift, I know I'm going to stop and be standing there with the bar. And so at the very end of that movement, I slow down But that's contrary to almost every sporting movement you have. I mean, if you think about the way you cue somebody to swing a golf club or swing a baseball bat, we never say...
Swing all the way through.
Right, we don't say, hey, right before we hit the ball, make sure you slow the club, right? Or if I'm swinging my arm to spike a volleyball, I don't say, okay, make sure you slow your arm down right when you hit the ball. We don't say that. But in essence, with traditional strength training exercise, that's what we're doing, is we're slowing that motion down at the very top of the movement. Whether it's a bench press, a squat, or a deadlift, we create that deceleration pattern as part of it.
I see. That reminds me of an old Rams football player, Adam Archuleta. He he's played for other teams, obviously, too, but that's how I originally came to know him back living in St. Louis. He kind of did his training to get around that, where he would use devices where he could let the bar go and accelerate all the way through the movement and then catch it, similar to that, I guess, anti-grav machine, whatever it's called, in the neuro lab that we have.
Right.
But yeah, he said the same thing with his training. Like, because when I'm tackling somebody, I'm not going to pull back the second before. No, I'm driving through them the whole time.
Right.
So it's very aggressive throughout, as opposed to, aggressive at the beginning, but then tapering off at the end.
You look at power, and there's a few things that contribute to a person being able to become very powerful. And we know that person's ability to create force at low velocities is actually quite important. So that's like the very start of a sprint race, for example. Yeah. You're not moving very quickly at that point. You're having to overcome your body's own, stationary inertia, if you will, at that point. The law of inertia, object in motion tends to stay in motion, object at rest tends to stay at rest. And so it doesn't want to move at that point.
Right.
So you've got to be able to create force at relatively slow movement velocities at that point. So that ability to be strong at slow velocities is important. And that's where traditional strength training comes in, because they're very slow. I mean, the heavier that weight gets on the bar, the slower you're going to move. It's that force velocity sort of relationship that you have, right? But that's an important component. We need to be able to be strong at those movements. But on top of that, we also need to be able to create high forces at high velocities. And that's where we get in training activities like you're mentioning, like throwing the bench press bar, jumping on a squat. It also includes things like overspeed running. Like, you have, this is common in track, where you'll have a runner and they've got attached to them a belt that's got an elastic tube that's attached to a person that's behind them. And the first person takes off sprinting, and you give them like a 2-second head start. And so as they're running, that tubing that connects the lead runner to the back runner is starting to expand and stretch. It's storing elastic energy. And so that second runner then begins running after the first person has gotten a head start, and they get tugged forward. And so they're sprinting, and it's called overspeed running.
Oh, okay.
And it's forcing that. This is oftentimes done during that peaking period of when that athlete's getting ready for that conference or national championship or Olympic championship. They'll do this overspeed running to kind of get them used to that ability to create forces at those really, really, really high velocities.
Oh, okay.
Same thing is true with running downhill, like not a very steep hill, but like a very shallow grade going downhill. You run down it in order to have that ability to handle those high forces and still create large velocities at those movements.
Okay, interesting.
So those are two kind of key contributors. This idea that you want to be able to create force at low velocities and be able to create force at high velocities. So you want both of those things. The other key part of it, which is the practice component for any sport, whether it's a strength training sport like weightlifting or something of that nature, is that your ability to coordinate that movement. And so if I have a lot of strength at low velocities, a lot of strength at high velocities, that's great. But if I don't actually know how to throw a baseball, I'm not going to be very good at it. Even though I have all the key ingredients are in the pot, I'm ready to do it. But if I don't know how to do it very well,
you don't have much control over it. So you might be able to wing a ball towards the plate, but it's not going to get over the plate at any given time.
Exactly. The example I give in classes is watching little kids learn how to play patty cake for the first time. It's not that they don't have the strength required to clap their hands together and clap your hands. It's like they don't know what they're doing.
Yeah.
They're not very good at clapping. They don't understand the pattern. But after 2 to 3 minutes of practicing with it, they all of a sudden get better at it. It's not because they all of a sudden got stronger. It's because now they neuromuscularly can kind of connect the dots a little bit for themselves. And what we understand from strength training is that those neuromuscular adaptations, they occur quickly. Right? And those are the first things. When someone engages in a strength training program,
first couple weeks, you're going to get pounds on the bar every single week. You're coming in there.
Nothing probably really happened morphologically with the muscle. They just got better at coordinate that action.
Yeah.
So those things happen very quickly, and so it's important for any kind of annualized, periodized strength training program is that a big portion of your year needs to be spent on acquiring those raw physical skills, that strength.
Yeah.
And then you use a smaller portion of the year to refine those skills, those movement patterns. And oftentimes that's the part that athletes don't always like. They like playing their sport, they like playing their game, but they don't want to
have to redefine things. I hear that a lot from golfers as they get stronger and learn how to use their hips better. Now it really messes with their swing.
Right.
Now they can bring their glutes into a more, really put their hips through and all. They have to spend a lot of time reworking their swing.
Yep.
And I've never really met one that liked it.
No. Well, it's the same thing with like a basketball player that they get stronger, all of a sudden their shot is thrown off because they lose that fine motor skill because their whole paradigm has been thrown out the window.
Right. Yeah.
So like something like track and field, like sprinters and stuff, that movement is kind of gross movement pattern enough that's like, if you gain if you put on the ability to squat an additional 100 pounds from season 1 to season 2, which isn't uncommon for younger athletes, they're just going to run faster.
Right. Yeah, because running by itself, like you said, is more of a gross motor skill than a fine motor skill, like something like a layup or free throw would be. Make sure you have the correct finger roll and the direction based on where you're approaching the net from.
Yep. So. And so, what you kind of talk about Adam Archuleta, I mean, those ideas that you don't necessarily need super unusual contraptions to overcome this natural deceleration that occurs in strength training movements. You just need to basically take a traditional back squat, for example, and turn it into a jump squat. So instead of stopping at the top and standing there, you instead accelerate all the way through that concentric portion and then actually literally jump off the ground.
Okay.
But one of the big controversies that's existed for years in strength and conditioning is like, well, how much weight should you use to do that? If I put on 80 to 90% of my 1 rep max, A, is it prudent to do that? Right. And B, are you even able to actually jump when you do it? And so it kind of plays in this idea of, and there's been interesting research done in this area too, to look at like, well, if I at least intend to move explosively, that actually changes that neuromuscular firing pattern as opposed to if I'm controlling my tempo. I'm like, okay, it's going to take me 2 seconds to lift it up. Even if I could lift it in 1 second, I'm going to make sure it takes me 2 seconds.
That's how we were always taught with weightlifting is you always accelerate through the movement. Even if you can't, 90+%, you still try
You're
to
at least
accelerate
trying to do it, right?
Yeah. Yep, that was always how we were told to approach it, no matter what the lift was.
Exactly.
You're going to be moving faster, increase that momentum as you move along.
But that distinction then still exists. It's like, if I'm still doing a traditional squat, I'm at least intending to move it quickly, but I'm still going to have that built-in deceleration at the very top.
Right.
Whereas if I actually allow myself to jump and keep accelerating all the way through the end portion of that squat movement, what ends up happening is that you get more time to create that force, which allows you to create more force because that's kind of that, again, that's that force-velocity relationship. It plays into another concept that's very oftentimes misunderstood, which is known as impulse, which is, how much force do you create multiplied by how much time did it take you to create that force, and which plays into the idea of momentum, which is another topic you just brought in, right?
Yeah. How interesting. So it seems like these two different training ideas, being able to generate force at very low velocities and high velocities, could both have a place within training programs. In fact, I think I've seen this sort of thing implemented on either strength days versus dynamic days or something of that effect.
And a big part of it comes into is like, well, is it my intent to train, like we talked about last week, this idea about block training where it's like, okay, for this 2 or 3 week period, I'm only going to do my traditional strength stuff. And then after that block is done, or that mesocycle or microcycle, whatever terminology you want to use, whenever that's done, I'm going to shift gears to now having more of a explosive.
Right.
I'm going to train now for high forces at high velocities. But the other thing you can do, like you said, is you can, and we talked about last time, is like you can mix both of those training strategies up in a given workout period.
Right, yeah. I had some jumps today as well as some power snatches along with some more traditional deadlifting. So I guess it might be an example of mixing the two.
Exactly. And what's great about that is, usually you'd think it's like, well, I should do my explosive stuff first in the workout because that's the most taxing on my body. And then after I'm done with my plyometric exercises or you insert whatever explosive movement you want to have be a part of that. And then after I'm done with that, then I'm going to go ahead and do my traditional strength stuff. It could even mean I'm going to do my Olympic lifts first, because they're kind of a weird gray area, because they're what we call a semi-ballistic lift, in that there is an acceleration period in there, but there's also a deceleration period in there, because there's that shift
during that
from
catch phase. Yeah,
right. Well, even during that
transition.
In that transition, that scoop phase between the first and the second pull, there's kind of a weird deceleration that occurs there, as well, as you kind of reposition your body and get ready to engage the hips and that kind of stuff in a different way. But anyway, usually when people look at that, they're like, "Oh, I should do those explosive things first, and then do my heavy strength stuff second in that workout." But there's good evidence to suggest that you can flip-flop that order, and it kind of plays into this idea of muscle potentiation.
Yeah.
And the idea is that if I do my heavy lifts first in the workout, I activate, or I hypersensitize the myosin and actin cross-bridging, and all of a sudden I'm able to make that muscle contraction, that cross-bridge cycling, occur at a faster rate. The problem you run into there is that if that strength training workout is too fatiguing, then you lose that potentiation benefit, because fatigue will always mask that potentiation you get out of it. And so it's not going to work for every athlete or every person you run into.
That's true. I know it works for me actually quite well when I've run some higher volume cycles where we squat first before anything, and then go into the main lifts. And it was difficult the first time or two doing that, but after a while, I really ended up liking it and feeling just fine going into my main lifts. By the time you're on your final set of clean and jerks, I mean, it's there's not much you can do to feel better then. But leading up to that, I never really noticed as much of a decrement to my performance as I may have expected. Especially when the weights would get heavier sometimes, but keeping it to modulating the volume with the intensity, so that way you're doing 90%. Well, you're only doing doubles or singles, or working up to a single. And all that, and it was sufficiently far enough out from when we were peaking, so that way it wasn't
you bring up a good point there. It's like, if people are used to structuring their workout in a certain way, where they do their Olympic lifts first, or plyometric workouts, or even agility stuff first, and then do their strength stuff, they might find a benefit in that flip-flop. It's going to feel unusual at first, but if you give it a shot, and you kind of honestly, this kind of goes back to that idea we had a couple months ago, this idea of the placebo effect, how you can fool yourself, right? But if you believe it could work, even though your body feels a little bit strange, it may actually potentiate your abilities to do it.
Yeah, that's very true. I forgot all about that placebo effect stuff. So maybe that's the point, is to not remember that that's how it works. But I mean, we've seen both ways, of course, for this sort of thing, where squats and gain squats at the end, at least in Olympic weightlifting, let's say. A lot of times you try to do the old bodybuilding idea of prioritization, where what do you want to get better first, or it needs to improve the most. Put that in the beginning when you're the freshest. But I definitely know that I've had a lot of success also from putting those big compound movements at the end of a workout as well, where you feel like you're more warmed up after doing these other things, and even just within the sets themselves, whereas you start to get in the groove, and then you went from one motion to now a whole different motion, although they're maybe in the same plane, everything's sagittal that we're doing, but it still takes you a while to get into that groove, and once you do, then you can, now everything's clicking for me, and everything's moving.
Yeah, I think the one thing that I would just caution people on is the idea of accumulated fatigue. That if you're really intending to have an activity be something that's designed to be as powerful as possible, you need to keep the volume low, and you need to keep your rest periods long. Because you start to groove poor neuromuscular patterns if you shortchange yourself on your rest. And if you're going to failure on things, prior to those power activities, if you got someone, for example, if you're doing some bench or some squat activities, and you're having somebody help you complete your last couple of reps, if you're doing forced reps, that's not going to lead to success. You've got to be able to still be able to do that work on your own. And for the most part, that potentiating effect occurs best when you leave a couple reps in the hole, essentially. It's hard, it's heavy, it's difficult, but it's manageable.
Yeah, and you could have done a few more, but
Right.
you're managing fatigue in this case. You
That's
don't
right.
want to always leave everything you have out
Right.
there
Right.
because that's fine during an event during a meet, but
Yep.
during practice, you're just preparing for the
Right.
eventuality that you get to show it off.
And that's the really hard part with any kind of power activity in a strength and conditioning workout is that I know when I can't, if I'm doing a traditional back squat or even a leg press or whatever activity I'm doing, I know when I'm reaching the end of my abilities because I can no longer lift the weight. Mm-hmm. And so I have a tangible feedback mechanism that's telling me that, hey, you're at your max. You can't do anymore.
Right.
And you need to stop. But with power activities, we don't get that because it's velocity dependent frequently. Power is, not only is it the rate of doing work, it's how much force are you creating multiplied by your velocity. Mm-hmm. So if your force is increased or your velocity is increased, your power output is increased. Or if either one of those independently is increased, you're increasing your power output. The problem you run into in power dominant activities is that velocity component can modulate, but you don't feel it.
Yeah.
So my first, if I'm doing box jumps, and if the box is 24 inches high, and I'm just barely jumping up to that 24-inch increment, and I'm doing sets of 10 or 20, is it really power at that point? It's not, because I'm not maximally trying to do it. The thing used to always drive me crazy is we would have athletes do medicine ball throws, and they would throw it either against a wall and catch it and throw it again, or maybe do an overhead throw backwards, overhead throw forwards. But if they're sandbagging it and not trying to throw that ball as hard as they possibly can with every single repetition, there's no point in doing the activity.
Yeah.
And if they're just like really daintily throwing the ball against the wall, that they lose that velocity component, and well, they're losing that force component too. And so the power output is so compromised that activity is pointless at that point.
Yep, I'll agree with that because there's a lot of times where working, especially with new lifters, we have them count reps, or even older lifters too. I mean, for myself, if I ever miss a lift, I'll usually count that rep in there with the rest of them because the effort was there.
Right.
I tried to accelerate, I tried to get through it, but either I left it out in front of me, swung it, whatever it is. But as long as I feel like it wasn't just you pick it up halfway and they're like, oh nope, hang on, something got in my mind. That in that case, you give it another go. But if the effort's there, then that's totally counts, and that's the important part is that you're trying to move that way as fast as possible in those cases.
So I'm just going to bring us back real quickly to this idea of like how much load should I use then? If I'm trying to take a traditional strength training activity and trying to make it be a power movement, so again, a movement that's designed to have me create a large amount of force at a high velocity, how much load should I use? And the old, and what you still see a lot of times out there, is this idea of 30% of your one rep max.
Yep.
And those numbers were all driven from old individual muscle fiber models in which they were looking at where is the maximal tension created in this individual isolated fiber. And it occurs at about 30%. But we're not constructed like that. We're more than just one muscle fiber. We're millions of muscle fibers, and we're also tendons and other connective tissue that's helping create that force. So a lot of the research that's been done by Dr. McBride has been looking at what is that load that allows for an optimal power output. And what his research has indicated for plyometric sorts of activities, so for your traditional jump squat activity where I've got a bar on my back and I'm just going to try to explode upwards with it, what he's found is that optimal load for maximal power is 0% of your one rep max, which means it's just your body weight.
Yep.
Because as soon as you put any load on your back, your force is increased because you have a heavier load you've got to work against.
Some more mass,
But the velocity is compromised to such an extent that increase in force can't compensate for that decrease in velocity, so your power output is decreased. And so you're better off if your overall goal is power in a lot of cases. And it's not to say you should never train with a load on your back and do jump squats. Just understand that that's not going to create the maximal power type of condition for you.
Right.
And so a lot of athletes that are trying to be strength power type athletes, they need to become comfortable with their own body weight and exploding and accelerating that mass forward. Doing, again, it could be sprints or agility drills, which is your own body mass, but also the plyometric activities, which could include basic things like skips and leaps and jumps. You don't have to have boxes involved. You don't have to. And people get involved with using weighted vests and things of that nature, and there may be applications for that kind of stuff, but it also is going to change the outcome of it.
I think that's a really good point, generally speaking, for anybody getting into training, is just keep it as basic as possible, because it turns out a lot of those really basic principles work very well.
Right.
Bodyweight stuff has been proven time and time again to be very effective.
Right.
Depending on what it is your end goal is, eventually you might have to touch some weights, but you can get a lot out of just understanding your own body and increasing your own proprioception, where you are in three-dimensional space and where your body's located, which is something a lot of people need, especially as we get older. Coordination is something that's going to become critical as we age. So, I mean, getting these body weight exercises and getting all of that under our belts and understood by our brains during training sessions is, I think, paramount importance.
I mean, to kind of just to recap, a lot of the concepts that we just discussed, the ideas of power and work, and how you create power, and those concepts, momentum and impulse, things that we just touched on, those are all biomechanical concepts that have a root in either engineering or physics. And we hear those words and we think about the calculations that are required for those things, but we don't always need to have a calculation. But a good kind of root understanding of what those concepts mean and how we can apply them into a strength training realm can go a long way to helping you make an informed decision about how to construct your short-term or long-term training plan.
Yeah, I think that all goes back to the talk we had a few weeks ago about which one's more important, that kind of in the trenches experiential learning or book learning, that sort of thing. I think this is a great example of how you need both of these to really tie this together. If you don't know what movements are or how they feel or where sticking points normally occur for whatever that exercise might be, you're going to have a hard time applying what you've learned in the classroom to what's going on there. You might kind of get the velocity stuff or anything like that, but I think that firsthand experience becomes very critical there as well.
Good. Well, I think we'll leave it at that. I think we may find it beneficial to revisit this topic and talk about things like torque, which we didn't get into. We didn't talk about any kind of rotational sorts of things, moment of inertia and things of that nature. We didn't talk about we touched briefly on impulse momentum, but I think that's an important concept to talk about when we look at impact and how we absorb impact.
And I had some ideas about how we tie all of this information back to muscle cross-bridging, because that's where, or the elastic property of muscle and cross-bridging is how we're going to generate a lot of these different phenomena or things that we're calculating.
This idea of length-tension relationship. I think this is definitely something that we should come back to at another time, because I think this is a lot to absorb, especially if you've not heard a lot of these terms or haven't thought about it in terms of your own workout before. It's a lot to take in.
Yeah, there's a lot of jargon, like you said. It's the combination or the marriage of these more engineering-based approaches with more physiology adaptations. So finding how to describe these things is often very difficult because you have to default to the engineering terms as opposed to being able to use the gym terms that we're more familiar with. So, all right. Very good, Travis. Thank you so much.
We'll see you next time.
Yeah, see you next time, Travis. Thank you.